The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $55 on a Saturday morning in early spring, and the whole yard sale laughed. Not a polite laugh either. Not the sort of chuckle a small town offers when it wants to be neighborly. This was the other kind. The kind that comes up out of the belly and rolls across a lawn full of card tables and flatbed trailers and hits the buyer square between the shoulder blades. It was the 12th of April, 1986, at the Halloran estate sale on the edge of Beaumont County, Kentucky, and the object that had just changed hands was a small, rust-freckled cash tin, no bigger than a loaf of bread, its lid soldered shut in a crooked gray seam that looked like a scar someone had drawn with a shaky hand. The woman who paid the $55 did not laugh back. She did not smile. She did not turn her head. She only nodded once at the auctioneer, folded her bill of sale into the pocket of her canvas jacket, and carried the tin away in both hands, the way a person carries something they already know is heavier than it looks. Her name was Merle Whitcomb, and she was 68 years old that spring. She had been the only working locksmith in Beaumont County for nearly 40 years, ever since her husband had come home from Korea with a limp and a trade, and had taught her every last thing he knew before the cancer took him in 1971. Her face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of squinting at pin tumblers under a bare bulb. Her build was lean, a little stooped in the shoulders. She wore a soft work cap the color of old hay, a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, and a canvas jacket that had been repaired at both elbows with patches she had stitched herself. Her hands were the hands of her trade, scarred across the knuckles, fingertips flat and smooth from years of feeling for what other people could not see. The man who was doing most of the laughing was named Del Rooker. He was 51, heavy-set, clean-shaven, ruddy in the cheeks the way a man gets when he lives on steak sandwiches and cold beer. He wore a bright green sport coat over a company polo, and on his wrist there was a gold watch he liked to shake down out of his sleeve anytime he thought somebody might be looking. Del owned a used car lot out on the highway and a storage rental business behind the Piggly Wiggly, and he had come to the Halloran sale looking for a walnut roll-top desk that he could flip to a lawyer in Louisville for 4 times what he paid. He had gotten the desk for $90, and he was in a mood to celebrate. He celebrated by turning to the crowd, sweeping his arm toward Merle's retreating back, and announcing in a voice loud enough to carry to the fence line that the old woman had just paid 55 American dollars for a soup can. He called the tin the biscuit box. He called it the tin sardine. He said maybe there was a sandwich in there from the Truman administration, and if there was, he hoped she liked mustard. The crowd laughed again, softer this time, because Merle was already at her truck, and a person only feels comfortable laughing at somebody who cannot hear. But Merle had heard. She heard everything. She had been listening to men like Del Rooker her whole life, and she had learned, somewhere around her 30th year, that the thing to do with a loud man was not to answer him. The thing to do was to keep working. Her old teacher, a man named Emmett Boyd who had run the shop on Vine Street before her husband bought it in 1954, had told her once that a lock does not care what anybody in the room thinks of the person trying to open it. A lock only knows patience or impatience, and it will answer to one and refuse the other. She had never forgotten it. She had never had cause to. She loaded the tin into the passenger footwell of her Ford, wedged it upright with a folded shop rag so it would not tip on the county roads, and drove home at exactly the speed the signs allowed. If you have ever watched a quiet person be laughed at for buying something no one else could see the worth of, and felt the whole room was wrong and only the quiet person was right, then you already understand what this channel is about, and I would ask you to take a second and subscribe, because the story I am telling you tonight is exactly the kind of story we are here for. Now, the tin itself. It deserves a proper description, because the crowd at the Halloran sale had looked at it and seen only what it was on the outside. It was made of tinned steel, about 10 inches long, 6 wide, and 4 deep. The original paint had been a dark green, but most of that had gone to rust bloom along the edges and to a soft, powdery gray across the top, where somebody had once set a hot skillet on it, probably by accident, probably a long time ago. The corners were rolled, not soldered, which told Merle it had been factory-made, likely between the wars. There was no hinge visible. The lid had been closed and then sealed all the way around with a bead of lead-tin solder, run by somebody who was not a professional, but who had cared enough to make the bead continuous. There were no gaps. No air had gotten in there in a long time. And there was one more thing. On the underside of the tin, so faint that Merle had had to tilt it into the sunlight to see it, there were 3 initials scratched into the metal with the point of a nail. Eoch Merle had known immediately what those letters meant, because she had lived in Beaumont County her whole adult life, and she remembered the Mallory case the way anyone from that county remembered it. Everett Hollis Mallory had been the assistant manager of the Beaumont County Farmers Bank from 1948 to 1957, and in the spring of 1957, he had been accused of embezzling $11,400 from the depositors' accounts. He had denied it. He had gone to trial. He had been convicted on the testimony of the bank president, a man named Silas Halloran, whose estate sale Merle had just walked out of. Everett Mallory had hanged himself in the Beaumont County Jail 3 nights before his sentencing. His widow, a woman named Ida Mallory, had moved to a small house on the edge of town and had taken in sewing to keep herself and her daughter fed. The daughter, whose name was Ruth, had been 11 years old when her father died. She was 40 years old now, and she still lived in Beaumont County, in the same small house her mother had left her, and she had never remarried, and she did not go to town more than she had to, and when she did, she kept her eyes on the sidewalk. Everyone in Beaumont County knew who she was. Everyone in Beaumont County had, at one point or another, either whispered about her father or looked the other way when someone else did. Merle had noticed the initials while she was walking past the flatbed where the tin sat with a masking tape price of $10 stuck to its side. She had picked it up, felt its weight, felt that the weight was wrong for something the size of an empty biscuit box, and turned it over. When she saw the initials, she had put the tin back down very carefully. She had walked a slow circle around the yard. She had come back, and when the auctioneer had gotten to the tin at the end of the small items table, and Del Rooker had opened the bidding at $2 as a joke, she had raised her card and kept raising it until Del got bored at 50 and let her have it at 55. Now she drove the tin home along the 2-lane through the flat, greening tobacco fields, and she thought about Everett Mallory, whom she had met only twice, once at a church supper in 1955, and once at the bank when she went in to cash a check. She remembered him as a small, careful man with a soft voice and ink on the side of his right hand. She remembered that when he had counted out her money, he had counted it twice, quietly, and had slid it across the counter to her without looking her in the face, the way a shy man does when he wants to be polite but does not know how. She had not thought about him in 20 years. She pulled into her drive a little before noon. Her shop was the front room of her house, the way it had been in her husband's day, and her workbench sat under the big north window where the light was good and did not shift much through the day. She set the tin on the bench. She took off her jacket, hung it on the peg, and washed her hands at the utility sink. Then she sat down on the shop stool and simply looked at the tin for a long time without touching it. There is a kind of patience that looks like laziness, right up until the moment it doesn't, and Merle had learned that lesson a long time ago too. By supper time, word of the $55 cash tin had gotten as far as the counter of the Blue Star Diner on Main Street. Del Rooker had told the story 3 times before his coffee cooled, and by Monday morning half the county knew that old Merle Whitcomb had lost her mind and bought a soup can at the Halloran sale. At the feed store they called it the biscuit box, following Del's lead, and one wag started calling it the $55 sandwich, and the joke had legs enough to carry it all the way through the week. If you have made it this far into the story with me, I would ask you now to go ahead and hit subscribe, because what happens next in Merle Whitcomb's shop is the part I have been waiting to tell you. On Tuesday morning, an old friend of hers named Harlan Beach came by the shop on the pretense of getting a key made for his tool shed. Harlan was 72 and had known Merle's husband since the 4th grade. He stood in the doorway with his cap in his hand and watched her work for a minute, before he cleared his throat and said he had heard about the tin. Merle did not look up. She was filing a blank on a hand vise, and she finished the stroke before she answered. She said only that the tin would open. Harlan waited to see if there was more, and when there was not, he nodded slowly and said he supposed it would, and he took his new key and went home. He did not repeat any of Del Rooker's jokes. Harlan was a decent man. He simply did not understand, and he was honest enough not to pretend that he did. Merle worked on the tin for 4 evenings. She did not rush. She began by cleaning the outside with a soft brass brush and a rag dampened in kerosene, taking off the loose rust and the powdery gray so she could see the seam clearly under her bench lamp. She studied the solder bead with a jeweler's loupe for the better part of an hour on the first night, tracing every inch of it, learning where it was thick and where it was thin, where the amateur who had laid it down had hesitated, and where he had grown confident. She decided that whoever had sealed the tin had done it in one sitting, working from the front hinge line around to the back, and that he had done it with a small propane torch and a spool of soft solder, probably plumber's solder, probably in a hurry but not in a panic. On the second evening, she warmed the tin gently on a low hot plate, just enough to take the chill out of the metal, and she began scoring the seam with a fine triangular file, running the file back and forth along the bead in slow, even strokes. She did not try to cut through. She only wanted to thin the solder, to open a channel that a thin blade could later ride in. She stopped every few minutes to feel the metal with the back of her hand, making sure it had not grown too warm, because if the tin got hot enough to soften the solder all at once, whatever was inside could be damaged by the heat. On the third evening, she took a thin, flexible paletted knife that she had ground down herself years ago for exactly this sort of work, and she began to walk the blade around the scored channel, tapping the handle with a small, rawhide mallet, letting the blade lift the softened solder a hair at a time. She worked from 6 in the evening until nearly midnight, and when she went to bed, the seam was open along 3 of its 4 sides. On the 4th evening, which was a Friday, she came out of the kitchen after supper and sat down at the bench and finished the 4th side in a little under 2 hours. When the last of the solder gave way, the lid did not spring open. It only settled, the way a thing settles when the pressure that has held it in place for a long time is finally released. There was a sound with it, very small, like a held breath, finally letting go. Merle set down her tools. She wiped her hands on her apron. She sat for a full minute without moving, looking at the seam she had just parted, letting the tin be what it was for one more moment before she asked it to be anything else. Then she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had gone yellow at the folds, there were 3 things. There was a small canvas bank bag with the drawstring pulled tight, and it was heavy. There was a manila envelope, sealed with red string wound around 2 paper buttons, and there was a folded letter tucked into the inside of the lid where it would be the first thing a person saw. Merle took the letter first. She unfolded it carefully on the clean square of butcher paper she had laid across the bench. The paper was thin, the ink was brown with age, and the handwriting was the small, careful hand of a man who had spent his working life adding columns of numbers. It was dated the 4th of June, 1957. The letter began, "To whoever opens this, my name is Everett Hollis Mallory, and if you are reading these words, then I am past the reach of the men who have decided what my life will be worth. I am writing this in the back office of the Farmers Bank on a Tuesday evening, while Silas Halloran believes I am reconciling the quarterly ledgers. I have 3 hours before the janitor comes, and I mean to use them to tell the truth, because there is no one left in this town who will listen to me speak it aloud." The letter went on for 4 pages in that same small hand. Everett Mallory wrote that he had discovered, in the spring of 1957, that Silas Halloran had been moving depositors' funds through a shell account in the name of a fictitious farm equipment company, and had been doing so for nearly 3 years. Everett had confronted him. Silas had listened. Silas had said he would think about what to do. 2 weeks later, Everett had been arrested on the strength of Silas's own testimony and a set of ledger entries that Everett swore he had never made. Everett wrote that he had known, from the moment the sheriff came for him, how the trial would end. He wrote that he had one night alone in the office before the auditors arrived, and he had used that night to copy the true ledger entries onto 3 sheets of onion skin, to gather the $1,140 of his own savings that he kept in the office safe against emergencies, and to seal all of it inside the cash tin he had brought from home. He wrote that he had hidden the tin at the back of the top shelf of the office supply closet, behind the boxes of carbon paper, where he believed Silas would never look, because Silas had never in 9 years fetched his own carbon paper. He wrote that the money in the bag was for his wife, Ida, and his daughter, Ruth, because he did not believe Silas would leave them anything, and he was right about that too. He wrote that the papers in the envelope were the proof of what Silas had done, and that he asked whoever found them to carry them to an honest man, and he named 2, a lawyer in Frankfurt and an auditor in Lexington, and said either of them would know what to do. He wrote that he was sorry to leave his wife and his daughter with the shame of what the town would say about him, and that he hoped, someday, someone would come along who was patient enough to find what he had hidden and set the record straight. He wrote, "At the very end, I do not know your name, I do not know your face, but I know that if you have gotten this far, you are the sort of person who does not walk past a small green tin because it is not shining. Thank you for stopping. Please finish what I could not." Merle folded the letter along its original creases. She sat at her bench with her hands flat on the butcher paper, and she did not move for a long time. Then she opened the manila envelope. Inside were 3 sheets of onion skin, covered in the same careful hand, showing dates and account numbers and transfer amounts that ran to just over $42,000 over 31 months. She opened the canvas bag. Inside, in bundles tied with brown string, were $1,140 in old bills and a small, cloudy photograph of a woman and a little girl standing in front of a porch, and a plain gold wedding band. She could have kept it, all of it. She could have taken the bag and buried it in her garden, and burned the letter in her stove and let Everett Mallory stay a thief in the mouths of Beaumont County for the rest of her life and after. Silas Halloran was dead. His son, who had inherited the bank, had sold it to a Louisville holding company 2 years ago and moved to Florida. There was no one left who would come looking, and no one would ever have known. She wrapped the letter and the papers and the bag in the oilcloth. She put them all back inside the tin. She closed the lid, which no longer sealed, but which sat flat again against its rim. She washed her hands. She went to bed. She slept, as far as she later told anyone, straight through until dawn. On Saturday morning, she drove out to the small house on Poplar Road, where Ruth Mallory lived alone. Ruth answered the door in a house dress the color of a faded hymnal, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired the way the eyes of a person get when they have spent 40 years being looked at sideways in their own town. Merle did not sit down. She set the tin on the kitchen table. She said that this had belonged to Ruth's father, and that he had left a letter inside that Ruth should read alone, and that everything in the tin was hers, and that she was sorry it had taken so long to get to her. Ruth stared at the tin. She started to speak. Merle touched her once on the shoulder, gently, the way you touch a horse that has been standing in the cold, and then she went out to her truck and drove home. By the following Wednesday, the lawyer in Frankfurt, whose name Everett Mallory had written down in 1957, had a grandson practicing in the same firm, and that grandson had the onion skin ledgers in his hand and was on the telephone to the State Banking Commission. By the end of the month, the story was in the Louisville Courier-Journal. By the end of the summer, the conviction against Everett Hollis Mallory had been posthumously vacated by a circuit judge in Frankfurt, and the state had ordered the Halloran estate to pay restitution to Ruth Mallory in the amount of $42,000 plus 29 years of statutory interest, which came out to a figure large enough that Ruth Mallory did not have to take in sewing anymore, and did not have to keep her eyes on the sidewalk when she went to town, and did not, in fact, ever have to explain her father to anyone in Beaumont County again. Del Rooker did not have much to say about any of it. He was asked, once, at the counter of the Blue Star Diner, whether he still thought the tin had been a soup can, and he grunted and paid for his coffee and left. His used car lot went under in the fall of 1988, and his storage business followed the next spring, and by 1990 he had sold his house and moved down to Ocala, Florida, where a cousin of his was said to have a boat. The tin itself was given, at Ruth Mallory's request, to the Beaumont County Historical Society, where it sits today in a glass case on the second floor of the old courthouse, with a small typed placard beside it that gives the dates and the names and tells, in 5 careful paragraphs, the true story of Everett Hollis Mallory and the woman who found what he had left behind. Merle Whitcomb went to see it once, on a Thursday evening in the late fall, after the Historical Society had closed for the day, but before the janitor had come to lock up. She stood at the far end of the room, near the window, and she looked at the tin in its case for perhaps 2 minutes. She did not go closer. She did not read the placard, because she already knew what it said. Then she put her cap back on and walked down the stairs and drove home in her old Ford. And the next morning she opened her shop at 7 o'clock, the way she had every morning for 40 years, and she filed a blank on a hand vise for a man who needed a key for his tool shed, and she did not mention the tin to him, and he did not mention it to her. So I will leave it with you tonight. If you had been the one to notice those 3 faint initials on the underside of a rusted little cash tin at a yard sale, and you had carried it home and cut its seam and read what was inside, and you had known that no one was left to come looking, would you have driven out to Poplar Road on a Saturday morning and set the tin on a stranger's kitchen table, or would you have quietly buried it in the garden and let a dead man stay forgotten?